since we're ready to go, we might as well go. First, I'd like to thank all of you and welcome you for coming out this evening. I realize on such a warm evening, maybe you might have found something else that you might have done. But I'm really very pleased to see such a group of people here, and I know that we're streaming and are able to be watched now and I think later on. But there's a context of what we're doing here this evening. As you know, the Holy Father has convened, initiated, convoked a year of faith that began on October 11th of this year and will go through the Feast of Christ the King next year. So we're already 1 month into a 13-month year of faith. And it had several points that the Holy Father in his letter describing all of this, Porta Fide, made for us, asking us to reinvigorate our faith, rededicate ourselves to the faith with various different components. One of them, the first, was to reacquaint ourselves with the Second Vatican Council, the most recent expression of the universal church of all of the bishops of the world coming together, not to state anything new about the faith per se, but to restate the essence and the heart of our faith for the modern world. October 11th was the 50th anniversary of the beginning of that meeting that took place in the Vatican, Vatican II, the Vatican Council. And so he's asked us to reacquaint ourselves with the Council, with the documents, with its teaching and its implications for us today. The second thing that he asked was that we acquaint ourselves more deeply with the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the summary of Catholic teaching which has flowed from the Vatican Council, which is a sure guide and a particularly well-organized and written response to so many of the questions to help us deepen our faith and understand better what it is we profess and hold as Catholics. The third point that the Holy Father asked us to do was to reinvigorate our spiritual lives, particularly in terms of the liturgy, particularly in terms of reacquainting ourselves with the depth, the beauty, the magnificence of the Mass and the Eucharist. And I would say it follows on with the sacrament of confession, that our lives within the sacraments of the Church be reinvigorated this year. And the fourth point that the Holy Father made was that we reinvigorate our lives of faith by means of our public witness to our faith. That public witness will be in various different ways. As we know, all of the challenges that the faith is undergoing, particularly in our society right now, the threats to marriage, the threats to the freedom of the faith, and so on, we have plenty of opportunities to witness to our faith. Witnessing in our families, witnessing in our schools, in our places of business. The other witness is charity, reaching out to those who are in need. Because if ever we are to imitate Christ, we imitate him by reaching out to the poor. Well, with that context, I've asked the priests, and I'm delighted to have a number of the priests who are here, and grateful again for Bishop Doran to be with us this evening. But I've asked the priests in the parish to come up with their own programs and efforts and means to assist all of the faithful in fulfilling this goal that the Holy Father has set in front of us. And to add our own context, we might say, across the diocese, we have initiated this series of talks, kind of an adult education, but young people I think could benefit very well from this as well. But the effort is to try and help each of you, help even our priests in the parishes, to delve into the Second Vatican Council in particular, that first point that the Holy Father gave us. And so we have a series of talks that are scheduled throughout the year that will go into various elements, various documents of the Second Vatican Council, so that we really get back and see what did it say, what does it have to say for our faith now in our circumstances in the modern world. We're very privileged to have the first talk this evening and to have Bishop Arthur Kennedy, the auxiliary bishop of Boston, one of the auxiliaries, there are several, who is a great scholar about the church, about our faith, about the Second Vatican Council, to begin to open the door for us in this effort on a diocesan basis to take a look at the Second Vatican Council. The bishop's talk this evening is entitled Faith, the Heart of Vatican II and the Foundation of the New Evangelization. In the widest terms, his task is to set the table for us about the Second Vatican Council, to give us some context about the Council, to give us some of the history of the Council, to give us some of the salient points about the Council that will help us going forward to understand better the talks that will follow, to understand our own efforts at reading those documents. So we're taking this as the first effort to open the door for ourselves for the Second Vatican Council. Bishop Kennedy, as I said, is one of the auxiliaries of the Archdiocese of Boston. He was ordained a priest in 1966. He studied at St. John's Seminary in Brighton, Massachusetts. Also got his license in sacred theology at the Gregorian University, and went on to get his PhD in systematic theology and the philosophy of religion at Boston University in 1978. He has served in numerous capacities with his academic and intellectual background. Professor, associate professor, particularly associated with the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota and in St. Paul. He worked for a number of years extremely successfully in ecumenical dialogue, was the head of the Office for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs for the bishops, amounting to a contribution to the church on a national and an international scale. Recently, he has served for a number of years as the rector of the seminary in Boston and continues to make widespread and numerous contributions to the church and to our faith. So it is our great privilege and our pleasure in this, shall we say, door-opening lecture for us to listen to Bishop Arthur Kennedy.
It sounds as though I can't hold a job. I mean, it's basically what it sounds like. It's a great pleasure to be invited here to open the celebration of the Year of Faith and this way in which it stands as the foundation for the new evangelization. Because this is, in a sense, a fulfillment or a stage in the fulfillment of not only what we have experienced in our lifetime and the way in which the church unfolded for us in the Second Vatican Council, the mystery that is at the very center of our lives, the mystery of God, the mystery of Christ, the church, the mystery of the way in which the church orders itself, the way in which all of those who will belong to the church are drawn into the mystery of faith and into the mystery of holiness, and how through living this in the manner in which the church presents to us what Christ asks of us and what he has given us, we become capable of being his mediators in the world. And this is one of the most important things that we want to be engaged in as we undertake this new venture, if you will. Not new, as Bishop Malloy said, in the sense that radical changes are come at stake, but rather the interiority of our own conversion, that it deepens, that it continually finds itself capable of more and more coming to understand the mystery of God's grace and his action in our lives. When I was working in the office for ecumenism, both in the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, and then for the United States Conference of Bishops, I worked frequently with people who were members of evangelical communities. And it was always interesting to me to see the way in which people who grow up in an evangelical church who have no sacraments, they have no sense of a participation in the fullness of the mystery of Christ's life, the mystery that Christ opens to us of God and the Trinity. But there is this wonderful thing that you find, is that when the evangelicals come to speak to you about the fact that Jesus has become their personal Savior, that is the breakthrough of interiority and a breakthrough of faith, which they are able to make clear and articulate to anyone who is willing to listen. And they will do it again and again and again. And every time I would meet these people who would have told me before that Jesus was their personal Savior, they were born again, they would tell me how that happened. And then they would go on to begin to talk about what had happened to them. What was God's grace in them since the last time they and I had chatted? This awareness of the mystery of God, of the presence of God, this is the interiority that the Year of Faith is speaking to us about. And it has many different levels. And so I would like to explore some of those with you this evening as a way of recovering and remembering the way in which the mystery of faith has been a blessing to us, that it has been a gift to us, and that gift is something which in many ways we have cooperated with and allowed to grow, so that the power of our own lives is strengthened by being conformed to the life of Christ. Because this effort that is now needed for the life of the church, the matter of the overcoming of what Pope Benedict called, in a talk that he gave to the members of the Vatican Curia last Christmas time, he called it a stanchezza del fide, a tiredness of faith. And so now it has to be revivified, and we have the opportunity to be able to cooperate in that and to become what, in a sense, the Vatican Council had in its most brilliant formulation offered to us, to become those who are united with Christ and therefore united with one another. There are times when I go out to celebrate confirmation with, in Boston, those who are confirmed must be 16 or above. And so we talk about many different dimensions of faith. We talk about the way in which that when we receive a gift, I like to talk to them about the experience of having been the recipient of a gift, and how a gift receives its power is really only when, in fact, the gift is properly accepted. And then the gift has an enormous energy to it. And how is it that the gift is properly accepted? Any gift. We know this about human gifts as well. It is when we are grateful. It is in the gratitude for the gift. That's when we have begun to accept the gift into the interiority of our hearts, our minds, our affections. And then I talk to them about the way in which Pope Benedict says something, an interesting way he talks about holiness, when we talk about holiness for young people. And he tells the story of his trip to England when he was there to for the beatification of Cardinal Newman. And they arranged for him to be on the radio in a certain BBC station. And he was able to speak to all of the children, the upper grade children and the teenagers in the schools in England, Scotland, and Wales. And he said to them at first, you know, it's very unusual for anyone to be able to speak to all the children in these schools, never mind for a pope to be able to do so. So he said, I am very happy to do this. And he said to them, you know, I'd like to ask you to think and consider something. He said, I'd like to ask you to think about the fact that I know that in the world that you are thinking about what it is that you can do. Be a teacher, be a doctor, be a policeman, be a lawyer, be an accountant, be a physicist. But he said, there's something else I want to ask you to think about, of what you can become. He says, I want you to think about becoming a saint. Because that is what, in the context of the gift that we receive, that we are actually being drawn to become a saint. And that is something important as we have just concluded the month of November, when we think about and pray about all of our deceased friends, family, and all the members of the church, and all the saints. To be with God is required that we be a saint. A saint in one way, either by having his mercy take possession of us, and taking hold of our interiority, or by the fact that our cooperation becomes so great that people recognize in us a certain holiness, and that is a certain witness about who we are. This matter of interiority I would like to mention in a different manner, just to see if we can see how much it takes possession of us. And this is to go outside of the Catholic tradition in order to do this. And I think it's a very interesting example of the way in which part of the interiority that we have and part of the difficulties that we face in the relationship of trying to bring faith through our culture, into our culture, is that the relationship of faith to imagination has become very lax. And it is not as if someday we woke up and said, let's make lax the relationship between faith and imagination. It's rather that, something we need to talk about considerably tonight, it's the way in which the culture that we live in basically dominates the structures, the images by which people begin to define themselves. This is especially true, of course, of young people, because they don't have an opportunity to have the memory of all of the kind of images that are possible within Catholic life. Those of us who are older know how all of these images, we see them, the church is filled with them. In Boston, I've been trying to put together a kind of a reawakening of the Catholic imagination. So we have programs that we're doing with some of the museums on the issue of art that is inspired by faith, and that carries not only wonderful techniques of how to paint, but also contains within it something of the mystery of the way in which faith has a vision of human life and of the world and of God. So we're doing that. Another one we have is faith manifested in stone and glass, in which we're talking about finding especially beautiful churches and having a little history and a little articulation of of the way the architecture and the interior of the church and so forth, the way in which it draws people into a sense of their identity and of their relationship to the Lord, and how it draws them together, how it brings them together, and how they begin to think of their place where they worship as a beautiful place, as a place of peace, and a place of comfort, a place of prayer, a place where together they worship and give thanks to God. And then also similarly in music. The example I would like to use tonight is from literature. And it's not about a Catholic author. Bishop Malloy is accustomed to me talking about Flannery O'Connor, who is one of my very favorite authors. But Flannery is such a good Catholic author that I thought it might be interesting tonight to think of someone else. And I'm thinking of the American Jewish author Chaim Potok. And there's a reason I want to speak about him, because he was an Orthodox Jew. And as an Orthodox Jew, he lived in a world in which all of the images that he faced were not related to his faith, but they were related to Western culture, its various forms of success, its various attempts at power, and its various elements of decline. He, at the age of 16, he had gone frequently to the library after Hebrew school. He went to a yeshiva, a Jewish parochial school. And he would come home and do his study, his lessons, and on rare occasions could get to the library to get some books to read. And when he was 16, he went to the library one day and said that he needed to find a book that would help him to understand the way in which the world that he was growing into could make some sense. It was at that same age he had told his mother, Malloy Potok, he had told her that he wanted to be a writer. She said to him, "Darling, first you will be a brain therapist, then you will be a writer." He went to the library and found this book, which he found the title fascinating in terms of the image it created. It was Brideshead Revisited. He took down the book, went to the librarian, said to her, "Is this an adult book?" She said, "This is a very adult book. You have to read this for at least 100 pages before you decide whether you're going to bring it back and not read the rest of it." So he read the book, and it was hard for him. What did he know? As he said, what did I know about Catholic? What did I know about English aristocracy? But it brought me into a world that gave me a sense that was more real than the world that I knew in my day-to-day life. Here's how he talked about it one time. I was a yeshiva boy, a Jewish parochial school. I would get up at 6:30 every morning. From 9 to 1, we studied sacred subjects, which consisted of this Talmud. And then we did our secular studies until 5 or 6 at night. Then I'd get on a bus, I'd go home, I'd have supper, I'd do my homework, I'd go to sleep. If I was lucky, I caught the radio program called The Lone Ranger once or twice a week. If I was really lucky, I made it to a symphony on a local radio station in New York. If I had made it to the Green Hornet, it was a messianic week for me. That was the way I lived my life. Up in the morning, school all day, home, supper, homework, sleep up in the morning, day after day, week after week, month after month. You can imagine I knew a lot about upper English Catholic families. I'll never forget the effect this book had upon me. It took me a long time to get into it. I had never read anything of this kind. That world was so strange to me. And every time I wanted to quit reading, I remembered the librarian's warning. I found myself inside that world. I lived more deeply inside the world of Brideshead than I lived inside my own world for the length of time it took me to read it. I remember finishing it. It was in the living room of our apartment in New York. Closing the book and looking down at it and feeling an overwhelming sense of bereavement. These people were gone from me now, and then I felt an overwhelming sense of astonishment. What had he done to me, Evelyn Waugh? The whole thing had only been a story. This is a remarkable account of interiority, and this is the interiority about which we must think tonight, of how something penetrates us. We become what it gives to us. And we are not just talking about upper English aristocratic Catholics. We're talking about the mystery of God incarnate and the way in which his gift to us can give us a whole world and a whole reality which defines our existence. So, our task is to consider the year of faith and Vatican II and the influences that are so important for us as we continue this year and as we prepare, because this year, in a sense, is really a preparation for the new evangelization. And while we're preparing for the new evangelization, I want to add, we are still part of the old evangelization, or what Pope Benedict calls the classic evangelization. And the classic evangelization is basically the life that we have known in our parish. It's the life of the sacraments. It's the life of prayer. It's the various pious practices. It's the life of charity. It's the care for all of those who come to us. It's watching and caring for those who are seeking and don't know yet where they're going to be or how they're going to find themselves. And so, this classical evangelization is what has brought us to where we are now. And it is not something to be abandoned. The new evangelization is to be able to make more articulate, both to ourselves and to others, the mystery that is underway within us, the mystery of God's presence. And so it is important that we don't divide up the classical evangelization as something over against the new evangelization. The new evangelization will include new means for being able to uncover for others something of what is in the hearts and in the minds and affections of authentic Catholic people. The new evangelization is a reawakening of a conversion within our lives. And so let us think about how that can happen. One of the things I think that's very important in the beginning of the new evangelization, and which is going to lead us into the importance of Vatican II and the other contexts and cultural dimensions of Vatican II that will be a source of strength for us, I believe, is the importance of remembering. Remembering is one of the most important Catholic matters. It is important to us because it is through our remembering that we are drawn into the mystery of the way God has been acting in the people of the Old Testament. It is remembering what God has done in calling the apostles to himself through Christ. It is remembering the way in which Christ has taught, the way in which he has healed, the way in which he goes out to seek, the way in which he teaches. And in that remembering, we have very practical questions we can ask. We can ask ourselves, when did I first really come to know Jesus Christ? How did that happen? How old was I? Who was it that taught me about Jesus? Who was that? Who, in what community, what family did that knowledge about the mystery of God come into an awareness of my consciousness? And what did we do? How did we celebrate it? How was it that we said our prayers, or what it was that we went to Mass at certain times, a children's Mass, or being brought from the children's Mass into the adult Mass, or going to catechism class? How was it that we belonged to a world which had within it a certain kind of substantive faith and culture? This, I think, is important, this matter of remembering, because remembering is the way in which we recover the range and steps of our own identity. And it's going to become a very important matter as we go on tonight to think about what remembering involves in the work of Vatican II. Because Vatican II is a council that is remembering the whole tradition of the Church. It's remembering the way in which the mystery of God has been at work in the Church and in the world. And it is important to think of these words that Pope John XXIII spoke at the opening of the Council, October 2nd, 1962. He said, "The 21st Ecumenical Council, which will draw upon the effective and important wealth of juridical, liturgical, apostolic, and administrative experiences, wishes to transmit the doctrine pure and integral, without any attenuation or distortion, which throughout 20 centuries, notwithstanding difficulties and contrasts, has become the common patrimony of men. It is a patrimony not well received by all, but always a rich treasure, available to men of goodwill." Our duty is not just to guard this precious treasure as if it were concerned only with antiquity, but to dedicate ourselves with an earnest will and without fear to that work which our era demands of us, pursuing thus the path that the Church has followed for 20 centuries. So the Council itself is a residue and a resource of memory. And I think it's important for us to be able to consider it that way and to remember why it is, in fact, that always remembering those things that have been at the center of shaping our lives and our identity and our interiority is so important. It is especially memory is for Catholics, because our entire life with Christ is grounded in the memorial of his being the Son of God, who at each and every Mass calls us to celebrate in the Eucharist his death and resurrection, which only faith can recognize, as the words that conclude the blessing of the chalice of his blood, "Do this in memory of me." Memory puts us in touch with the communion of saints, and not only with those of our own deceased loved ones, but of all the saints who have ever lived, all who have shown us deeds of holiness and charity and mercy. It is interesting that one of the great saints of the Church, St. Augustine, speaks constantly of the importance of memory. And he shows in his Confessions the way in which he is able to trace out his conversion. And his conversion is a very complicated one. He was caught up in the cultural world not unlike today. And his struggle, first of all, was he wanted to know what is true. He wasn't first interested in God and being in love with God. He wanted to know what was true. And his first conversion is not a religious conversion, it's an intellectual conversion. And as he struggles with how to know what is true and how he wants to belong to what is true, he's not interested in opinions. He wants to know what is so. And in that conversion, the intellectual conversion, the memory continually traces out for him the struggles where he went a little bit of the way, and then he backed off. And then he went a little further and backed off. And then finally, he yields to the call that truth makes upon him. And in his religious conversion, it is the very same thing. He's always remembering things that have happened in the past. And he sees his friends who are becoming Christian, and he wants to know, why can't I become a Christian? And he's in a garden, and he hears children playing a little game. And he tries to remember, is that a game I played when I was a child? And the game that they're talking about has a little phrase in it, take and read, take and read. And he picks up the scriptures and reads a passage from St. Paul about the power of God's grace and mercy. And in that, the conversion begins in his heart to bring him to the faith. And there's something always wonderful about Augustine, because when he yields, because in a conversion there must be a yielding, a letting go. And when Augustine yields, there is always a shedding of tears. Because Augustine knows that the letting go is not easy. Augustine has, in some sense, placed himself in another world, or belonged to another world, in the same way that Chaim Potok belonged to another world until he read the works of Brideshead Revisited. And so, we have this ability now to bring to memory and to find those ways in which we can remember how God's mercy has affected us. Because this is a way in which we are going to be able to rediscover the mystery that is given to us through the council, and to become witnesses in new evangelization. Because we cannot give what we do not have. And the mystery that we have in the participation in faith. That's why the year of faith is a preamble to the new evangelization. We have to become first what we need to mediate later. Now I want to say something about the importance of the catechism. The catechism serves as a remembrance for the purpose of increasing our faith in God. And the catechism is very valuable because it introduces one of the very crucial components that faith contains. That is, faith contains a knowledge. It contains a knowledge. It is first and foremost a trust. First and foremost a trust that the one who is giving me all that he says is capable of providing the meaning and hope of my life and beyond my life in this world. It is a trust. The Greek word speaks of faith as first and foremost a trust. But it contains then a knowledge. The trust contains a certain knowledge. This is why, and I'll talk a little bit about it more later, why there is a strange connection, but we don't clarify it as well as we might, which is what I would like to try and see if we could do tonight, between faith and belief. In the Creed, we talk about what we believe. And then we have all of the testimonies of the dimensions of the mystery, as the Creed brings them out for us. So we believe, and we believe as if it was a form of knowing, but that it's faith that introduces us to the belief, because we trust the one who has taught us what he is now asking us to believe about him. The Catechism then is very important because it presents to us the way in which all of the dimensions of Catholic life can be found. And it's perhaps especially in our age, when there can be so much confusion about the knowledge that comes through faith, can lead to discouragement. Or it used to be I thought I understood what faith was, but now it seems I hear all of these strange things and now I'm not sure. The Catechism is there as a way of helping us to see exactly what does the Church teach. It's not a matter of various opinions about things, but what exactly is the foundation on which we establish our relationship of our knowledge of God and our knowledge of Christ. Also, the concern that the Catechism has, the concern of the Catechism of 1992, the Catechism that came as a result of Vatican II, it teaches us how to become just, how to become charitable, how to become good, how to become engaged in the sacramental life, how to pray. It teaches us so many of the things that are so central to life of the Church. And it presents us with the development of a tradition as it's come to a certain kind of fulfillment. Because one of the things that is important is in our journey of faith is that we all go through stages. And the stages can sometimes be very disrupting. Sometimes because of the culture, sometimes because of our own hearts, sometimes because of evils that we encounter that we just do not know what to do about them. And we just do not have answers to them. Because evil is not a problem that we can solve. Evil is a mystery. Evil is a mystery which threatens everything. It's a darkness which is exactly what Christ comes to overcome. As Vatican II will see in the Church document on the Church, Christ is the light that overcomes the darkness. But the darkness doesn't go away. And the darkness can grow incrementally. And that sometimes we may feel paralyzed by its power. But God is there. That's the whole point of the understanding of faith. God is there for us. So the Catechism speaks to us about all of these matters, about helping us to understand these various stages and dimensions of our lives. And to realize that when we reach one stage, we oftentimes become seekers again. We're looking for the knowledge, we're looking for the mercy, we're looking for the grace of the next stage. And so the Catechism teaches us the way in which we can come to know God and to begin to love God more deeply. This is only the second universal catechism of the Church. The first catechism, which was called the Roman Catechism, was published after the Council of Trent. And it was published just for the education of the clergy, principally so that they could be good teachers in parishes. But the 1992 Catechism of Vatican II, that's a catechism, while it's given to the bishops and the clergy, it's for everybody. It is for everybody. And it is a way in which the Church continues to maintain its identity for us as a place in which we can come to meet God. Another topic that is important as we come to Vatican II is the issue of faith and reason in culture. This is a very complicated matter because we all think we know what reason is. We logically work things out. We're successful at doing that. And we're engaged in becoming professionals, or we know we're great mechanics. I used to wonderful to listen to the Salviazzi brothers on public radio when they would start talking about how when someone would call up and they would say, my 1987 Nissan isn't working anymore. And they'd say, what's the problem? And they'd describe it. And then they would have these wonderful things where they'd say, well, could you imitate the sound it makes? And so they would have this way. But it was through questions that they would come to some understanding. There was some knowledge that they had. And then they would talk back and forth in a kind of dialogue, as you know, as to what would the proper solution be. We're good at our intelligence and our reason. And yet there is something about the way in which modern reason works that isn't good. And this is one of the reasons that Pope John Paul II, Blessed John Paul II wrote his encyclical Fides et Ratio, on Faith and Reason. The New York Times had a front page editorial, Pope defends reason. I think it's a surprise to them. But we have to say, if there is a crisis of faith, there is also today a crisis of reason. This is why Pope Benedict is constantly talking about the difficulties of relativism. Relativism is a very complex notion, and it really begins to come into Western thought in the 19th century. And it comes into Western thought because of the discovery of a very important form of knowledge, that is history. We all know many people who love history, and certain parts of history. We all probably have special areas of history that we like. But when history is used in a certain form of reason, what it basically says is, well, you can never make a judgment about anything that is true, because you know what influenced the person who said that at Vatican II, or the person who said that at the Council of Trent? They were all historically conditioned. And so this is called historicism. And what it basically does is it is in fact a misreading of history. But at the same time, it has become a way in which people always will suggest that they can't know anything. You can't know anything. The church can't know anything. No one can know anything. And this is endemic in our culture. And I can tell you that when it was a time when I was rector of the seminary the last 5 years, it was very interesting to see how few students we would get who studied in the humanities, in literature and history and sociology and so forth. The people that we had who would come in would be people who were in engineering or in the natural sciences, because there's no ability to be a relativist when you're building a bridge. There are rules and standards that must be abided by. And even the Pagliazzi brothers, in their notion of how to fix a car, is the same thing. So we have this problem, and that it is within our culture, and I'm sure you know it as well as I do, how it can take possession of us. And then we begin to apply it to such things as the Catechism or Vatican II, and so on and so forth. And this creates a suspicion. It's a fundamental suspicion that nothing really can be known to be true. That's a culture in which we presently live. And it principally affects all of these areas of human sciences, of ethics, and so forth. And we need to be aware that this problem is something that we need to stand firmly against, because of the fact that it ultimately destroys our ability in the long run to know anything, and it eats away at everything that is most valuable, including our friendships, including our faith, including our relationship with our families. I come then to the question faith and belief, which I had mentioned to you earlier, and I want to just see if I can bring a little distinction here that might help. I said faith was concerned with trust. Belief is concerned with knowledge. So the fact of the matter is, and this is one of the ways, in fact, that relativism can be overcome. Because there basically is a situation such as this, that namely the social sciences of sociology, psychology, history, and all those sciences that so many young people study today, they're the ones that pose a lot of these problems for the present understanding of identity It's a basic defeat of memory, which is one of the main reasons I started with memory. Because memory is not easily relativized. Because memory is remembering facts. When did I first begin to think about Jesus? Who told me about Jesus? What did we do? Belief is principally concerned with knowledge, but belief is not just a religious form of knowledge. Most of what people know, they actually know because they believe what somebody else has told them. Partially that's important because we wouldn't have advancement in any field of knowledge if there wasn't belief. Because we can't be everywhere. And we can't study everything. And so therefore we acquire an education, so much of education and learning. It takes place because we accept as true what somebody else has communicated to us. And think of this, the more you are closely connected with someone at the level of trust, the stronger is the capacity of your belief. The stronger is the grasp of your belief. Because you trust someone not to lie to you. You trust someone to tell you the truth. So belief is accepting as true what is communicated to me by another. And it's one of the reasons in the old act of faith in the church, it always used to talk about why God could be believed, because he could neither deceive nor be deceived. God is truth. And so therefore the relationship of faith and belief in the religious framework of Catholic life is very strong. But it's also important to remember that without belief in all other areas of life, there would be no progress in knowledge or science, because everyone would have to repeat every experiment, every theory would have to be called into question over and over again, and there would simply be no time for progress. Faith and belief, then, they go together. And they go together in a very important way, especially when we're talking about the relationship with God. Let me say something about, then, just two persons who are examples of faith, Abraham and Mary. Abraham, the father of faith. Abraham was a Babylonian, the modern day Iraq. He was a Babylonian, and he lived in a world which was completely dominated by a cultural vision that the highest thing that existed was those things of nature, which recurred again and again and again. It was a cycle of cosmic returns, nature going back over and over and over again. Why? Because, of course, in terms of an intelligent position, it seems to have something in its favor, because what it's basically saying, look, any one of us as creatures don't have the existence that something that lasts forever does. And this cycle just keeps lasting forever, going round and round and round. Something in Abraham's soul is awakened. Something makes him ask a question. Because obviously what happens in Abraham is an awareness that is simultaneously a gift and simultaneously an action, a human action. That he senses in himself, my being is not controlled by the mountains and by the cycles of the moon. But in a cosmogonic society, you made the politics follow the way the cycles of nature were. And so imposed upon people by the politics of the cosmogonic world were the absolute annihilation of human freedom. Because freedom introduces something that can't fit into that system of eternal returns, cycles over and over again. And it's that awakening to his freedom that begins the quest. And into the quest comes the gift. And against everybody else around him, against everyone else around him in that culture, Abraham accepts that he belongs not to the cosmogonic cycles, but to God. He doesn't yet know what God is. And one of the most important elements in that account is the story of Abraham and Isaac. Because basically, when God asks Abraham to take Isaac to the top of the mountain, it sounds as if, and he really hasn't broken out, he's still in the cosmogonic world, because in the cosmogonic world you always sacrifice the firstborn. But he takes Isaac to the mountain. One wonders what is within Abraham's heart at this point. But in that moment of the exchange, when God exchanges, because what Abraham has done now is not just follow the cosmogonic cycle. Abraham has been obedient to the God he has just discovered but doesn't really know. The obedience, his freedom is used in a way that makes him obedient to God's call. And because of Abraham's willingness to listen to God, the exchange is made between Isaac and the goat. There's a great lesson that God is teaching Abraham here. It is important, of course, to be grateful for the gifts of life, but you do not destroy life in order to be grateful, to show your gratitude. And this is one of the most important lessons that ripples through the whole of the Old Testament into the New until we come to the mystery of Christ's death on the cross. And there is Mary. She's the fulfillment of Israel. She's the one who is called to be drawn into the mystery of the very coming into the flesh of Christ, of the incarnate Word. And it's interesting as we listen to the way in which Mary is engaged by the angel. She has a question: how can this be? Her faith also has a question: how can this be? And she gives a reason: I do not know man. But Mary lives again in the same way by faith, and that faith is what makes possible her being the model for all of us, even after Christ's life, death, and resurrection. And I think it is very, very important that in the year of faith that we seek again the protection and the love and care of Our Lady. On October 12th this past year, Pope Benedict went to Loreto, which is one of the famous Italian places of Marian pilgrimages. John the 23rd had gone there the day before he opened the council. And he dedicated the council to Our Lady and asked her protection so that those who would come to know it would be able to know her Son. Benedict now rededicates the work of the Year of Faith and the Synod of Faith to Our Lady. And I think that one of the things that becomes very important in this matter of the faith of Mary being able to provide for us the foundation for the way in which our own faith seeks to engage the great struggles that Mary had to face, including her question, but also her suffering, and also her actions without necessarily always comprehending things. And that is to to begin to think about the rosary in a way that is presented in similar framework that I was raising those simple questions. When did I first come to know Jesus? How is it that the angel's apparition to Mary is when she first comes to know about what she is called to be and to do? And it's in, as we saw in Abraham, it's in the will, it's in the freedom that she accepts that call. What do we do in relationship to that ourselves? So that the mysteries of the rosary frequently are capable of revealing to us questions about our own experience with God, our own experience with Christ. So that they become little ventures of interiority as we, in a sense, begin to belong more and more deeply as we go through our memory, not only now of ourselves, but of our memory of Mary as well. The rosary then becomes of great importance. And then the counsel in terms of its remote and proximate conditions. Here we can't spend a lot of time on them. Some of them are very complicated and difficult, but we'll just mention a few of them so that we'll have time for some questions. One of the things that was of resource to the Council, of course, was all the prior councils, but especially Vatican I, which had taken place in the 19th century. And then that was closed down after shortly over a year because of the political changes that were going on in Europe. And they had dealt with two fundamental questions. One was the issue of the problem of faith and reason that we just talked about, in which the great concern was that reason could be just a kind of rationalism, and when rationalism, there is absolutely no room for God. There's no room for anything supernatural. It's all contained. It's like an intellectual cosmogonic culture. Everything is controlled. And then the other thing was the danger of faith without reason, or what they call fideism. So you just have faith and you just say, well, I don't need to have any intelligence with this matter. This is beyond reason. So it's connected with it. So those two things they talked about. But then the other thing was about papal infallibility. And when it was time to talk about more elements of the church, the council closed down. So in a sense, Vatican II was beginning to pick up on some of the issues about the church that were a part of Vatican I but had never been addressed. The other thing is that there was the theological disciplines were not up to snuff, let's say. And this goes back again to the question of faith and reason, because in the theological disciplines there was a great deal of work that went on about how you can know things that are universal, that they're beyond the reach of any kind of particularity or any particular history. And yet all the disciplines that were growing from the time of the French Revolution and a little bit before were all of these disciplines that were concerned precisely with what is the particular, what is the unique, what is the historical event. So, and the theology disciplines were not capable of being able to hold those together adequately. And so it was a weakened condition that was both in Vatican I and a little less so in Vatican II. And then I think most importantly we want to know about Pius XII. Pius XII, who was the Pope prior to John the 23rd, was an amazing figure in the preparation for the Council of Vatican II. He, of course, was dealing with the horrors of European life after already having gone through a First World War, now the Second World War, then the communist regimes, and so forth. So the relationship of the church to the world was very, very estranged. And the church was no longer looked upon by Europeans as a kind of overview which held people together, but now it was nations or ideologies such as Nazism or communism. While dealing with all of that, while doing what he could to save Jews all through the area of Rome and throughout Italy, he was also thinking about what was the important thing. What did the church need to do in order to, because these people who were all engaged in these ideologies and all engaged in these wars, these were all his people. These were all Christians. What had gone wrong? So Pius undertook some very amazing things, and I can't go into all of the detail. He was Pope for 19 years. And in that time, he began working on helping to make the liturgy more pastoral. That is to say, that the liturgy would be more available to ordinary people, that it would be, they would speak to people in the deepest of dimensions of their hearts and their longings and their desires. And so he began very quietly, and he made only few changes himself. One of the major ones in 1951 was on the change of the Holy Week celebrations. Another thing that he was concerned about was the understanding of the church. He spoke of, St. Paul had talked about the church as the mystical body in which there are many gifts, and all the gifts are interrelated to one another, and they're all given by Christ and the Holy Spirit. And each gift is for the benefit of the whole. And the eye doesn't say to the foot, I don't need you. But this was considered at Vatican I as too vague. But now at Vatican II, because of Pius XII, it becomes one of the most important ways of thinking about the way we are related to Christ and through him to one another. So in Mystici Corporis, the mystical body, he gives us that. And then also he was involved in an encyclical on the liturgy, but also he did a number of other things in changing. He restored the permanent diaconate, and he began to change the curia. So he began the internationalization of the curia. Let me then speak about just a few of the documents, because I know you're going to hear more about the documents in greater detail, but let me just say a few things about what I think has come to a new knowledge in the last maybe 5 years about Vatican II that I think is so crucial for us as we begin to look to further conversation, but also to think about what I've been talking about of the interiority of faith and of love. Pope Benedict has often referred to a presentation by a German scholar in 1993 when he retired from his chair at the University of Münster in Germany. His name was Johann Baptist Metz. The Pope says he wrote this: "The crisis reached by European Christianity is no longer primarily or at least exclusively a church crisis. The crisis is more profound. It is not only rooted in the situation of the church, the crisis has become a crisis of God. To sum up, we can say, religion yes, God no. Or in the more modern American form, we say, spiritual yes, religious no. Where this no, in turn, is not meant in the categorical sense of the great forms of atheism. There are no longer any great forms of atheism, although they are beginning to come back. But this is 1993, he's reading. Today's atheism can effectively return to speaking of God without really intending him or his person. The church has her own concept of immunization against the crisis of God. She no longer speaks today of God, as for example she did at the First Vatican Council. We need now today to speak about God and not just about the church. For the church comes out of our understanding of the mystery of God. This, I think, is important for us to realize so that we can deepen our understanding of the teachings and meanings of Vatican II, because a great deal of effort has been put upon the way in which we understand the church. And that, in a sense, has hidden the question about God from our vision. And faith first must address that experience of God. The Pope has called the church to a year of faith. The faith offers the principal access to God as one revealing himself to us. Pope Benedict, as a priest, served as a theologian at the Vatican Council, and he was brought there by the Cardinal Archbishop of Cologne, Germany. As the council progressed, the then Father Ratzinger's fears and hopes about what he saw happening began to be lessened as he heard what was being written in the document on Revelation, Dei Verbum. This is about what is Revelation? The question had been, what are the sources? What are the sources of Revelation? And he had said, no, the question is what takes place in the Revelation? It's not sources, it's about meeting God in the Revelation. This is the interiority. This is the kind of thing Chaim Potok, in a sense, was talking about when he was trying to find a world, or that he had found a world, that he had entered into and discovered a whole new way of understanding himself and his faith. It was coming to understand that the mystery of God was given to us first and foremost through the Scriptures and the Revelation. And Father Ratzinger was so delighted at the end that it finally had come, after many, many times of reviewing the document, that it centered on the person of Christ and not on propositions about him. A document focused on the reality of revelation as the self-disclosure of God to man. Secondly, in regard to the dogmatic constitution on the church, here again, this is one of the major there were four constitutions. This is the second. The Revelation is the first one. This is the second one. And you can read the excerpt on this at the bottom of page 2 of the excerpts. From the church's understanding, Christ is the light of the nations, and it is accordingly the heartfelt desire, it is said of this council, being gathered together in the Holy Spirit, that the light of Christ, reflected on the face of the church, may enlighten all men. This matter of the church, therefore, taking its constitution from the very person of Christ, that it is, in a sense, the way in which Christ has chosen to be present to us is through the church, becomes a very important part of the way in which our faith seeks to embrace Christ in the way in which he has chosen to present himself to us. I want to, before concluding, I want to speak of one final thing, and that is what I call a continuum of conversions. I mentioned it briefly, or hinted at it, when I was talking about Augustine's conversion, which began with his intellectual conversion, his great struggle toward his religious conversion, his conversion to Christ, and then his moral conversion. His moral conversion is to do the good because of the fact that the good reflects what Christ is. And his affective conversion, and I mentioned that oftentimes when he senses that he has to yield something, he begins to weep. This is an indication of the need of an affective conversion. So I think we need to talk about a continuum of conversions. And we can enter into the conversions at any point. The conversions are the things that move us toward faith and ultimately become the fruitfulness of faith. But we might have some people who are they're seeking first for the truth, as Augustine was. Or they may be seeking first for the good. Or they may be seeking first for some sense of having a composure about their own life, in a sense the way Abraham was. But the thing about understanding a continuum of conversion, I think, is very important, is that it permits us to be able to enter into all of the dynamics of human interiority, because we do all these things. We do want to know what is true. We do want to know and try to live by the good. We do want to know what is the ultimate good, what is the mystery of the fullness of truth in God. And we do need to transform our desires. And that is the conversion of affectivity. We allow grace to transform our desires so that we always are concerned about the love of God when we are desiring anything. Where does God fit within us? This continuum of conversion, it seems to me, provides us with the opportunity to understand the way in which the counsel can draw us to the fullness of the mystery of faith and prepare us for the new evangelization. And so, let me conclude with a meditation formulated by St. Ambrose of Milan, who was one of the teachers of St. Augustine. He writes, "So stand on the firm ground of your heart." What standing means, the apostle taught us, and Moses wrote it. The place on which you stand is holy ground. No one can stand except the one who stands firm in the faith. And yet another word is written, but you stand firm with me. You stand firm with me if you stand in the church. The church is the holy ground on which we must stand. So stand firm, stand in the church, stand there where I want to appear to you. There I will stay beside you. Where the church is, there is the stronghold of your heart. On the church I'll lay the foundation of your soul. Indeed, I appeared to you in the church as once in the burning bush. You are the bush, I am the fire. Like the fire in the bush, I am in your flesh. I am fire to enlighten you, to burn away the thorns of your sins, and to give you the favor of my love and grace. I hope that the year of faith and the continued knowledge that comes through Vatican II and through these matters of memory that we have that allow us to enter into the interiority of those who have gone before us and have spoken for us will be a great source of support for you and for all the members of the Diocese of Rockford in the days and months ahead. And thank you very much.
Are there any questions? We're going to just go to about 5 or 10 minutes, about 8:15, so get your questions in now. Anybody, just raise your hand. We'll pass the mic down.
Bishop,
Yes.
first of all, I'm a 2007 grad of St. Thomas, so it's wonderful to see you and hear you again. So I was particularly struck by your sort of reflection on the role of memory, and I was particularly interested in, especially in the context of Year of Faith and the ongoing new evangelization, what's the role of memory and martyrdom, especially in the church's experience throughout the world? And truth be told, I mean, we really don't have to go back to even Roman times to talk about this. This is right under our nose,
Yes.
so to speak, the
Yes.
20th century, and then even today in the Middle East.
Yes.
Are there any efforts, especially I think in the Western world, in North America, Western Europe, the Anglo-speaking Catholic world, to reflect, to raise awareness, if you will, but also emphasize a sense of solidarity with really, the church suffering for witness of Christ in the Catholic Church?
That's a very good question. Yes, it's something that we oftentimes don't take as seriously as we should, because in effect, the martyrs are the first and most prominent witnesses of faith. And we celebrate them liturgically, and as martyrs are, more recent martyrs are identified, the Church establishes days of remembrance, days in which their memory is celebrated and held up, their lives held up as examples to us of the way in which faith can have such an amazing grace that it is able to stand against the turmoils and the hatreds of culture or ideologies that seek to do everything they can to annihilate that faith. And in order to annihilate it, they annihilate individuals. T.S. Eliot has a wonderful account of the martyrdom of Thomas Becket in his play Murder in the Cathedral. And it's wonderful in the sense that it says, first of all, that martyrs never choose to be martyrs. Martyrs are called to be martyrs. And this is something the Church always is very careful about when it's seeking to determine whether or not a person is a true martyr. We need to be, again, aware, as you say, we need to be aware of the Church suffering persecution, and we need to be aware, in some sense, how we might need to think about going forth to demand certain kinds of political responses to people when persecutions are taking place and no one ever stands up for those who are being persecuted. This happened, I think, back maybe during the Carter administration. There was an effort in one place where there was a lot of persecutions. I don't know if it was Nigeria or not now. But I think we are limited in what we can do when God calls a person to be a martyr. I think what we can do is we can pray, we can accept their martyrdom as a gift, and as a gift which has the power to strengthen our faith and to help us realize the incredible mystery of evil that has the capacity to try to attack and destroy faith by attacking those who hold the faith. So the Church does have memory. I think one of the things that we need more to do, I've always tried to suggest, and I think it would be a great idea for the Year of Faith, that we try to go back. And there used to be these little booklets that we would give to children, and they would be listing martyrs. There would be pictures, and there was a one-page little account of the martyrdom of the saint. And I think that might not be a bad way, because catechesis is so crucial, because that's part of the way we get the memory going in young people, is to be able to catechize them, to teach them what has happened in the Church, both in terms of its own activity and its relationship to cultures. So, thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. We have time for maybe one more, possibly two more questions. Anyone? Hands raised?
Thank you. Bishop, you talked about the discipline of theology, and its answer to the crisis of reason of the 18th century. Could you expand that a little bit? the disciplines
Sure.
of theology? Could they not answer these?
They couldn't answer the new disciplines that were developing. Okay, so here, let's see if I can put it this way. The church always, and is taught in its seminaries, the importance of philosophy. And philosophy was, in a sense, was learned principally to be able to enter into dialogue with the various proponents who would define what human reason and reality are. And so what happened was there was a certain kind of decadence that developed in philosophy, really beginning in the late Middle Ages, and that's one of the reasons that the popes began to request for a recovery of Thomism, so that it could be able to be usable again for the church. Because one of the things that happened was so they did then develop, they recovered some of the philosophy, but the philosophy was principally concerned, and it was admirable in its concern. It was concerned with understanding how you can have a coherent set of concepts that will kind of hold the world of intelligence together. Okay? But what it couldn't explain was these new disciplines that were developing, mostly coming out of the Enlightenment in Europe. So in the 18th century history, in the 19th century culture, meaning of culture, the meaning of psychology, the development of sociology, economics. Those were all the sciences that the philosophical tradition was not able to respond to. And that was where the life of people's living was actually taking place, was within those areas, those practical areas. Now it's interesting what the response of the church was to that. Because it didn't have the adequacy of making responses that were completely coherent, they started the development of writing encyclical letters. And encyclical letters were very specific. They were aimed at very specific issues of what does the church say about X, Y, or Z. And that's the way it was the popes rather than the theological community that really began to respond to that problem.
Thank you, Bishop.
You spoke a bit about atheism in the 1990s, but today we have what's called the new atheism.
Yes.
How do you think that the new evangelization should respond to the new atheism?
Very good. So this is where we really need to put a lot of energy on training people within the philosophical disciplines, because a lot of these efforts are they're philosophical debates, a lot of them, and the problem is, in some sense, I think that the value of the new atheism is that it has forced the question of God back onto the table. Okay. And so therefore, while we talk, and we still need to talk about clarifying things about the mystery of the church, as is clear, and Pope Benedict is especially clear about this, it is the understanding of the mystery of God and what ways in which that reality can be grasped through human interiority. This is why human interiority is so important. The experience of God comes not from outside, it comes from within. Conscience, says Newman. Conscience is a place in which is the very fundamental source of knowing God. Okay? So it comes from within the dynamism of the human quest for fulfillment, for meaning, for purpose. And I think part of the issue that we are going to have to deal with the new atheism through new evangelization is to take advantage of being able to learn how to respond to that differently than the way we responded to the 18th century problems that we weren't ready to deal with. We're better dealing with this now. I put together a program in Boston for lay people called the Theological Institute for New Evangelization. And it's amazing. We have a master's degree in this, and we didn't really advertise. The first year we had 13 students. This year now we have another 17 with 30 students. And it's amazing how these people are capable of beginning to address these questions, the question that you raised, precisely from within the new evangelization, but also from within this sense of the interiority, which is the way in which God is first discovered and known.
Bishop Kennedy, I think we've had a long and a very fruitful evening here. And I think one of the things that I take from this is the depth of the task that Pope Benedict has put in front of us. That to read the documents of the Second Vatican Council, to bring back our, not only individual, but our collective memory as the church, and bring it to the fore again in the renewal of faith, to bring about that renewal of our interiority as we read the documents, so that it's not just words on a page, it's not just, I know what chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, but it is taking that and taking it into our hearts and into the depth that is going to be the real source of conversion. I think as we've seen with the bishop's presentation, we don't live in a snapshot of the moment. We live in currents of thought, of human experience that go and flow for centuries. You and I are the product of what has gone before. You and I are producing the product of those who will come after us in the context of faith. I think that's a wonderful thing that the bishop has opened up for us this evening. I look forward to our further conversations about the Year of Faith, about particularly the Second Vatican Council. Bishop, thank you again for coming out and for all of your efforts and your thoughts and your encouragement to us. I'm sure you have a few minutes after if anybody wants to come up and ask any questions privately. But may we give you our thanks at the conclusion of this evening for your presentation. I want to thank again particularly Father Peck and St. Rita's for giving us the venue for this opportunity. And I look forward to other talks in the series that will help us to deepen our knowledge and our love of the Church and of the Second Vatican Council. Thanks, and everybody have a good evening.